So, Kayla, thank you very much for speaking to me. A brief preamble on how we met in the first place. So, we met at Dragon Meet, where I purchased one of your games here, Psycho Dungeon. But you'd been doing this for a while already, and I've seen some other videos that you've done, including brushes with Gen Con. So, I wanted to ask you first of all how you got into design in the first place.
So yeah, I've been designing since I guess the end of 2020. I got into designing quite shortly after getting into RPGs full stop. I only really got into RPGs in around 2018, 2017. So like as an adult, I was in my maybe mid early 20s at that point. I can't remember my exact age. And my first exposure to role playing games was through indie role playing games. Like the first thing I ever played was a GM-less cyberpunk thing, which I've never been able to track down because I think it might have just been written by the person I was playing with. The first game I fully read through was Monster Hearts 2. So I think like that kind of early exposure to RPGs as something the people playing were making and people were making independently rather than I guess seeing it from this like polished form. Maybe that's something that like immediately made it a bit appealing. Around 2018 I think I did write a game that I play tested with some people but never actually published. So I always say, oh, I've been making games since 2020. I did make something in 2018 just sort of privately. Then yeah, around 2020 it started out from a sort of game jam in a Discord that I had fell into having some accidental administrative powers over. So I helped organize that game jam and wrote some small things for that. And essentially, my early dive into RPGs, why I was making so many different small half-formed ideas when I first, it was honestly like I just was going for a quite difficult personal time in my life, and being able to kind of like shut out the world and just focus on making something was there. I think what I got out of it immediate that time was how much you could finish something straight away. Like I was making things and then they were done and then they were on itch. There wasn't so much this like big initial process of iteration, which at that point in my life was appealing to me. As I guess lots of other art forms felt kind of closed off because, like I said, 2020 it was tail end of early lockdowns, I guess. But yeah, that was my start with RPGs.
Okay, so thank you. So being the psychologist that I am, I've got a follow-up which I'd like to ping at you, but feel free to bat this one straight back. So one thing I find really interesting is that you started designing almost as soon as you started playing, which is unusual. I mean, people
Mm.
tinker a lot, but to start designing early is unusual. And you said it helped you through a period, a difficult period. Was there something specific then? This is how the two come together in my mind. Is there something specific about designing that you found was more helpful taking you through a difficult period than just playing?
I suppose. I mean, I think the thing is like playing. I've written some solo games, but I'm not massively into solo games. I more prefer multiplayer RPGs, which always feels weird to use the word multiplayer because it's more the default assumption. Um, and at that difficult period in my life, I really felt unable to organize anything. I really lost touch with a lot of friends. So to some extent, the appeal of designing at that point was I could hyperfixate on something. And maybe it was almost this thing of like, yeah, I could hyperfixate on something that had this imagined social possibility or dimension to me. Or maybe it was just like it was a form I knew and I gradually found more people I could share this stuff with or show it off to. Um, there was probably some initial intent of maybe I'd play with the people I lived with, but that housing situation in itself like shrunk and developed and other things. So like, yeah, I do. It's interesting because I do feel in talking about it like that's no longer the reason I am designing RPGs. I'm not really looking for a distraction here. At this point, it's now like an art form I enjoy working in and enjoy creating in, and I do much more make with a mindset of I'm not going to write anything at this moment in time where I don't think I'm likely to play it. It's not even so much like there is stuff I could write that I would want to play, but would not necessarily feel because I'm not a confident organizer of social hangouts. I'd be like, I wouldn't be able to get that to a table. so I won't necessarily write this idea. I do much more now thinking in primacy of like, when could I play this and would I want to play this?
Okay. So you won an award. Do you want to say something about that? Because that sounds like it came pretty early in your design career as well.
Yeah, I won a Diana Jones Award Emerging Designer. They select 8 finalists for that award, and then they select 4 winners from those lists. That was in 2023, so that was probably only 2 years after. That it's as an award. It's eligible for people I think who've been working for 4 or less years. So it was intended for people very early career. Um, and I submitted in with lots of like essentially just a broad selection of the indie games I was doing, and I guess a statement about my own practice. That was, I guess, after at that point I was more comfortable just designing as a thing I was enjoying rather than needing a distraction. But also, it was a weird point. It was not a point where it was like my main focus. I was still doing it while broadly working uh, as a teacher, which was my job at the time. And yeah, so then the trip came in August, which was the school holidays. And as I went back and did not return to work, and it's not so much like that the award was a turning point in me trying to make it more of a primary focus. It more just, I guess, kind of timed out that way with me like leaving the workforce due to health reasons, essentially. But yeah, it was nice to be recognized at an early point in my career as someone who was exciting essentially and who had something to say, and who I guess had like an interesting point of view. And yeah, I went to Gen Con. It was in 2023 at that time. I enjoyed my time there. There was part of me that's like, I think at that point in my time, I didn't necessarily know how to get the most out of a convention, but I think that's the sort of, I guess, inherent like trickiness with a prize that is an opportunity, you know?
This is maybe a tough question, but have you ever introspected or have you been told as to what it was that led you and your games to win over other people? Is there a particular aspect of the game that you think stood out for people that you've been able to identify?
It's hard. I mean, so after winning the prize, I also often get asked for input on the next following year's like emerging designer award class. So I have an understanding of how that process works now. I'm not sure if it was the same then. The way it works, I believe currently is essentially a group of people, usually graduates almost of the emerging designer classes, look through all of the submissions, narrow down the finalists, and then the finalists were sent on to the judging body of the main Diana Jones Award. I believe that's how it works now. I don't know if it was necessarily how it worked then. I feel like probably based on at least conversations I had, it was there seemed to be some recognition of I offered something really different and really unique. And that still seems to be a point of praise I do get a lot of like, wow, this is something not like other things. And then this is not necessarily to claim like some kind of like, oh, I'm truly innovative. I've never been inspired by anyone else. I've been inspired by loads of other people and other books, but maybe just the way it seems to come together, there's maybe some perspective that can only be coming from me. I don't necessarily know where that comes from. Part of me sometimes wonders maybe it is a result of having got in through indie RPGs and not necessarily had a background in D&D or anything that just makes me feel very different to the mainstream of games. Um, I do also know I think like the award was looking to recognize sort of underrepresented designers, and so I can see how like I also did fit that brief of like, oh, this is someone up and coming who's not linked to a company, who is essentially like a working class woman doing everything by herself.
Okay. So straight in then in terms of how you think TTRPGs have influenced or changed you personally, the playing of and or the designing of in that period, it's a relatively short period of someone's life, 2020 to now. What impact do you think they might have made on you psychologically um, and anything else you can think of in relation to that?
I think sometimes if you are very invested in an art form, it often does sort of become like an immediate way you relate to things. And I've seen this in lots of other stuff. I've seen like films about like creators of musicals, which have tied in with that. I've made a joke about it as a stand-up comedian before about the thing of like, oh, when something bad happens to me, I'm now thinking about how I can make it a joke. And it's often a thing of like, oh yeah, the way I can sometimes think about what I'm seeing is through this lens of RPGs. Yeah, so I think that can have an effect. With RPGs specifically, I think like in the I guess like 6 years I've really been focusing on them, my conception of what I like to make with an RPG has changed and developed. I think it's really given me a lot of insight into themes that interest me. I've said a lot, all of my work seem to focus on themes of like connection and alienation. I can see how a lot of the protagonists are sort of like impacted and marginalized and disenfranchised by societal forces. I can see how there's a sort of cynicism to depictions of friendship and a apprehension but a desire, an apprehension about but a desire for optimism. And so often I can analyze my own work almost like I would analyze any other author's work and go like, oh, I can see these things about maybe that maybe says things about the ways I see the world. And sometimes I've got things from looking at things and been like, oh, I don't necessarily how do I feel about what this is saying or stuff. I looked at like a recent focus of some games of mine and I was looking at and worried like, oh, is this feeling a bit nihilistic? So it's yeah, I guess it's like that kind of tap in and touch in. I think it gets me thinking about narratives and archetypes and symbols a lot because those I think are a lot of the kind of stuff I essentially trade on in the RPGs I'm working on. I'm thinking if I'm, you know, playing with a genre, I'm often thinking about it very sort of semiotically almost. But I and yeah, then I guess the other thing is just there are certain games I think of where, as I've written them, I'm like, oh, I can see that I've got something out of exploring a certain concept through a game. I think Caught in the Remix, which is a game I wrote that was kind of like, is essentially about a group of friends trying to escape a extra dimensional nightclub that is trying to warp its own form to keep them trapped inside. And I think that that was a way of me exploring a lot of what I feel about like social situations and friendships under pressure, especially in sort of under a overstimulating social environment, but also then about like the ways groups of people come together. Like that let me explore that and come to my own sort of thoughts and feelings about that in the present day. Psycho Dungeon was really informed a lot about my feelings of trying to exist in the workplace as a neurodivergent and increasingly physically disabled woman. And then I do think writing Psycho Dungeon, even though I didn't realize it at the time, gave me some clarity of thought that then allowed me to go like, no, I can't work anymore. I am no longer fit for work and I'm no longer cut out for these environments and I need to find Sandhouse about the way I engage with the world.
Yeah, that's a very honest answer. Thank you. Because I was just thinking in my head as well about, okay, is there a balance between how much you think your games reflect you and how much you think your games change you? And I think the longer you went into that answer, the more I thought the balance was becoming a bit more 50-50. Initially, it felt a bit more like it was there were reflections of you. Um, but it sounds like actually, yeah, they also tell you something about yourself as you design them.
Yeah, and I feel like I can see the way the games are the reflection of me, and I think when I talk about them in certain lights, I can. But I do also feel like most of my games, or at least like a lot of the games post, say 2023, are, even if there is a thing of, oh, I know I'm exploring something personal, it's not so much that I am making a game where I'm like, this game is about exploring this thing. It's more me finding the personal resonance of a game and an idea. But like Psycho Dungeon isn't specifically about teaching, or about, they're not so much like set interpretations and allegory. It's more the personal meaning I instilled to it, but often I can acknowledge the way that Psycho Dungeon is so essentially about work. People often bring their own stuff to it, and what Psycho Dungeon's meaning is transformed by the collision of audience and text.
Okay. Um, okay, so having designed many games, you, not me, um, if you is there a kernel, is there a core to each of them, the signature that is always there, maybe even of all TTRPGs, not just the ones that you make, that at least all TTRPGs that you've experienced, once you kind of burn away the mechanics and the presentation and everything, what do you think is at the heart of them?
To be honest, there's part of me that believes what we call TTRPGs may really be, if you strip down to the bare, a couple of different concepts that are sort of existing. I almost sometimes think of like the term TTRPG like the term football, in that it can maybe refer to six different sports with their own sub variations. I think if you strip down a solo journaling game to its core, it's about, a relationship between a text and a reader where they are being invited to complete it. I don't think that's at all what happens if you strip down a game like Psycho Dungeon to its core. There, I think a lot of my TTRPGs, if we strip them down to their core, I think they are ways of exploring emotionally charged character relationships, with a sort of, you know, in a way that is half theatrical and performance based and half mechanical and gameplay based. But I don't think that base definition would also apply to, say, D&D or many OSR games. But I think we're both making TTRPGs. We're all making TTRPGs. It's just maybe what that we're maybe growing different kernels.
Okay. Um, so on a slightly different plane then. So you are a designer. I don't know how much, and you didn't play much. I don't know how much you DM as well or GM. Do you think that it takes something different to design games relative to run the games relative to playing in games? And do you think that you can almost observe these differences in the people that you meet in the TTRPG sphere?
Yes, a lot of the I've GM'd some games, but more often than not, I tend to play one-shot games that need to be facilitated, but don't necessarily have like a clear division of GM play. Not exclusively, but I do think that sort of changes my perception a bit, where I'll design some stuff for a GM, but more often I'm designing for a facilitator who is probably also going to be a player. And maybe that is about a sort of a different kind of. I feel in RPGs there is often this sort of overlap between GMing and organizing, facilitating. I think if there was less that overlap, I'd probably enjoy GMing way more. A lot of my most straightforward GMing experiences have really come from scenarios where I've asked someone else to organize a group that I then GM a game for. I think maybe it does require like a different way of looking at a game, because you're not looking through it through the lens of like what a character is doing and how your character is contributing to a story. But at the same time, I think you can, like, you're looking more through how is the story working and how is the whole thing holding together. Like it takes that perspective, but I also think some players as they play have that perspective. I think as a role player, I always know I'm actually quite reactive to what I think are the needs of a story or other players. Like I'll create characters who are designed very comedically, and then I'll realize, like, oh no, everyone else is the comic relief. This story needs a straight man. I'm going to pivot my character while maintaining these ridiculous elements, but I will now play like the straight faced counterpart to other people wanting to be comedic, or I will, or like, oh, a lot of these characters are uninterested in this main plot. I'm going to play someone who is, I'm going to make my character more invested in that. And I think that's probably a perspective of like why I do enjoy GMing when I do it and why I enjoy facilitating games. Maybe because it's a thing of even when I do play a character, I don't necessarily approach them as so much my avatar. I approach them as a space to explore. Um, but I don't know. I think there are different mindsets to. I think it's like divisions of like GM, player, designer. They can attract different mindsets, but I also think not uniformly. I think there are some GMs and players who are massively similar. I think there are some designers and players who are very similar, whereas I think there are some designers who are way more similar to GMs and don't necessarily play much without um don't necessarily play much as a player, which also can be fine because they're still playing the games just from a different persistent angle, and that informs their design in a way. I've talked to I've talked to another designer who mentioned about like maybe a prevalence of former teachers in RPGs and was discussing about like, do you think there's something about like asked me if there was something about like a crossover between a forever DM and a teacher who just wanted his kids to sit down and listen. And I was like, that's maybe interesting because as a teacher, I think I was so like we're all doing this together, guys. Let's all make sure. And I think like, oh, I can see a difference of why I'm not designing for forever GMs maybe, and it's maybe because of the same reason I was not a very strict teacher either.
I've heard the teacher overlap thing many times
Mm.
from a number of people. I was a teacher and I am a teacher now, and I barely ever play, only ever GM. So I think there might be, anecdotal evidence in favor of all that stuff. Um, okay, one more question for you then. So neurodiversity has become an increasingly prevalent topic within TTRPGs because it appears from recent evidence that there's an overrepresentation of, in particular, autistic people within the gaming community. So if the worldwide prevalence is approximately 1%, it could be closer to 10% within TTRPGs. And that's very recent and small sample data currently. Um, but whenever I do tell someone about this stuff, they say, yeah, yeah, of course, that makes complete sense. So anecdotally as well, it also seems to kind of bear out. In your game design, do you, and I recognize I don't think anyone does yet, but do you think about if a player is or a GM is autistic, for example, or neurodiverse in some way, that you accommodate them in some way through your design, or is that something that might come down the line?
Um, I would say I do think about it honestly. I think probably because when I was a teacher, so I actually also for context, I have autism. Like that also lines up with my experience just anecdotally of being like, yeah, no, I feel I've known more than the average amount of autistic people in RPGs than certain other spaces. I also have ADHD and dyslexia. So when I was a teacher, I was paying a lot of attention to ways of making information communication easier for neurodivergence. And I think as like a layout person in approaching a game's presentation, I often do think about that. I really hate when a game ends a section on a page and then starts the next section on the same page. I think you should always be starting on a new page. I think ideally you should be behind a page turn because that breaking up of information across pages will like chunk it a bit more. That's me mimicking the way of like PowerPoint design. Um, Yeah, I think even the way like I might approach an example of play of when I'm like, does this need an example? Because does that I think I'm thinking about this. Someone did once tell me that like the way I'd done layout felt very easy for them with dyslexia, and I'm like, I guess that makes sense because I designed layout I would find easy to read, and yeah, I guess I am always thinking about how would I want this to be communicated to me. Obviously, the expression if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I don't believe my experience is entirely universal, but like there is, I guess, this melding of some stuff I took from teaching to neurodivergent children or students and still apply that to information designing games. I think a potential another angle though is I saw a as I mentioned before, I'm also a comedian, and I don't entirely want to like steal someone's joke, so I'm not going to like use the joke. But they were telling a. I saw another comedian, Sam Nicoresti, do a joke about how many autistic comedians there are. Was saying a thing about like, oh, the art form that's a lot about overthinking about how you come across and wondering all about the rules of certain interactions. Yeah, I bet there's loads of autistic people there. And it's like, yeah, I think RPGs, which so often are about like a breaking things down into sort of scripts, routines, and procedures. I'm like, yeah, they definitely, I think, have an attraction to people with certain autistic traits. Um,
Do you think that's true
no,
for you
it's
personally, by the way, if I can interject there? Do you think that's true for you personally as well? Or
yeah. I think probably the fact of what I enjoy maybe about a lot of games. I don't know. I enjoy. Let me actually just think on that. I do think that's true for me personally, in that like, yeah, a breakdown of like, oh yeah, there's a clarity in RPGs and how you're playing that I think makes that appealing to me. Um, Probably for the same reason that stand up appealed, and probably for similar reasons other things I've done appeal to me. I Yeah, so I think that's plausibly part of it. Like there's almost a nature of like a form. I think a fact of like game phases is potentially appealing there, which also, yeah, I've often sort of found has personally appealed to me. I don't, but yeah, outside of maybe the ways of information design and a sort of gut feeling of, oh, maybe the form of RPGs itself does hold some appeal to autistic people more broadly. It's not so something I think about in like say a mechanical design of a thing. I don't necessarily say when designing like a strong or weak move versus a dice roll think which is more neurodivergent friendly. I guess because I don't have any gut instinct on what would be. I think if I was to try and make an argument of token based moves are more autistic friendly, I would actually just be trying to assert my preference as more accessible, and I don't think that would be true. Um, yeah, did that make sense? I worry I went off on a lot of different
no,
trails.
completely. I'm really glad that I've been able to ask that question because I haven't asked this question very much because the data is so recent. But and to receive an answer from someone who has a knowledgeable position on it as well, I'm really, really pleased. Um, Kayla, thank you very much for your time. I've really appreciated speaking to you. It's been really interesting for me, and I feel like I've learned a bit. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and yeah, uh, thank you for having me on.